my name is Raúl Zegarra. I'm a teaching fellow at the University of Chicago. Today we're going to be talking about a very important book by Gustavo Gutiérrez, A Theology of Liberation, published in Spanish in 1971 and in English in 1973. But Gutiérrez's work on many different projects over the years, expanding the view, adding elements to his initial perspective in liberation theology, spiritual issues, the study of some key thinkers like Las Casas. The focus of today will be on liberation theology, but we will see how some of the topics here are really articulated in a way that covers his whole work over the years. So why this text matters? I mean, the most simple and candid way to put it is because nothing was ever the same after it was published. This was one of the most influential, important books of theology of the 20th century. And the most important thing about it is that it was able to give a response to a very important conundrum in the 60s and 70s. How to be a person of faith, how to be a Christian in Latin America, to be more specific, and also have commitments to political change, to progressive political change. That was the answer that Gutiérrez was trying to answer, and the influence of the book depends precisely on how impactful the answer was. So let's talk about the communities that were influenced by Gutiérrez's work and by liberation theology in general. This book was really an attempt to respond to Christians in Latin America that were becoming more and more aware of the situation of social injustice that they were experiencing. They were trying to organize and mobilize, but they weren't clear about how that had something to do with their faith. They were able to be Christians and also support social movements of liberation? It was a difficult question. They didn't know what to do. And one of the main contributions of Gutiérrez's work was to provide an answer that said in a line, yes, you can. You can be a person committed to liberation. You can be a person committed to social change. And you can do this from the perspective of your own faith. In this sense, this book changed everything. People started reading it. It was translated very quickly to multiple languages. It became a widespread perspective in theology in the 20th century, perhaps one of the most influential. And really what happened here is that people started realizing that this answer, that you can be committed from the perspective of the Bible, from the perspective of faith, to social change was not Marxism, was not communism, was simply something that was at the core of Christian revelation. Unpacking that was the task of Gutiérrez's work, and that's why it was so decisive. The most important difference in Gutiérrez's liberation theology when it comes to the question of poverty is to think about this in terms of systemic, structural injustice. As we know, the tradition, Catholic, Christian alike, has always been very committed to the situation of the poor and trying to help them with almsgiving, charity, and many other forms of assistance. But not really until the 60s, and until really the development of liberation theology by Gutiérrez, we have a new way to see this, not only as something where we need to help the poor, but to actually think about this as a broader and more complex and encompassing issue, that poverty has reasons, and reasons have to do with systems, with how we run our countries, our economies, politics. So Gutiérrez tackled this issue and identified this systematic matter, and make this systematic matter, which is political at the end, something that can be considered from a Christian perspective, and then something that can be fought against from a Christian perspective as well. This is a decisive change in the history of Christian thought, and this is part of the influence of this book. If you want to think about this in a very simple, practical way, this is a very objectively influential book. It was quickly translated in many languages, and it just became part of, many of the developments of theology after the 60s and the 70s. Feminist theology, eco-theology, Latinx theology, Black theology, in many ways, are directly engaging the work of Gutiérrez and other liberation theologians, and thinking about the situation of oppression from many different intersectional angles. So what started in Latin America with the question of poverty and the question of social marginalization quickly became also a question of what happens with race, what happens with gender, what happens with the planet, what happens with non-human animals. The concept of liberation, the way it was framed by Gutiérrez and some of his colleagues, became expansive. and in that way influential and transformational for future generations. It is rare to do theology today without some acknowledgement of the importance of the concept of liberation and the decisive role it has had in any developments that we see today. I think we need to talk about two different things that are equally important. On the one hand, the ecclesial Catholic context of the 60s and 70s. On the other, just what was going on in the world. The most important event that took place in the years prior to the publication of Liberation Theology and the many books that follow is the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church from 1962 to 1965. This was really an absolutely massive change in the experience of the Catholic Church over history. It was the first time that the Catholic Church very openly embraced democracy, very openly embraced, interreligious dialogue and the possibility of salvation in other religions, and very importantly took a different position about how to relate to culture and the world. The idea was that human dignity, the protection of the dignity of every single person, was the bridge between the church and every other movement, every other organization in the world. This was taken very seriously by the bishops of Latin America who were present and very active at Vatican II. And just a few years after, in 1968, they put together the very famous conference of Medellin in Colombia. This was perhaps the most important development in all conferences of bishops over the world that took seriously some of the developments present in Vatican II and asked the question, what is to be a Christian in this new world? What is to be a Christian when the Vatican is telling us that we need to engage the world differently, in a more horizontal, dialogical way? The bishops of Medellin, the bishops of 1968, started thinking about the situation in Latin America. And what they realized, because it was so obvious, so patent, it was that inequality and social injustice was a marker of Latin American experience in a way perhaps that was not in Europe, where the main question was atheism and decline of religion. So the question in Latin America was, why can we remain committed to the Christian faith and tolerate so much injustice, so much poverty? The answer of the bishops was present in the conclusions of the document of Medellin, where they very decisively took the position that the church itself should mobilize its infrastructure and its potential and its social capital to change the situation of the poor in Latin America. The most important theologian in this meeting was Gustavo Gutiérrez. Gustavo Gutiérrez drafted many of the documents, organized many of the theologians and bishops to produce and vote accordingly. And the effects of this 1968 meeting in Latin America and in the church were just immense. But we need to take into account also what was going on globally. These are the decades of revolutions, anti-colonial civil rights movement, sexual revolution. There was a real change that was also permeating the position of the church and certainly the position of the theologians, thinking about how to relate with society, how to relate to these new developments. So the key issue taking place here is that Gutiérrez draws from the developments of Vatican II, draws from the developments of Medellin in 1968, and in 1971 puts together the first, systematic articulation of this very fundamental conviction that the world and the church are not in opposition, that the church can do something to change the situation of people in the world. Moreover, that this is necessary because it comes from the commitments of Christians to a God that loves everybody, but especially those who live in oppression and marginalization. It is also very important to think about another key player in this conversation, was the importance of Marxist thought in the revolutions that were taking place in the 60s and the 70s. Marxism, for many people in the church, was considered equal to atheism and to anti-clericalism. So many people in the church, even though they were open to some of these new changes motivated by Vatican II, open to a new relationship with the world, they were very aware of the risks of going the direction of Marxism, at least in their view. One of the key contributions of Gutiérrez was to make obvious that there were other ways to commit to social justice and the transformation of the situation of inequality of many people, ways that could nurture, the movement with Christian ideals, that could actually think about this in terms of what God reveals in the Bible to the Christian believer. So one of the reasons of the great influence of Gutiérrez is that he was able to think about an alternative path that could think about these progressive developments in Vatican II and Medellin, but organize the already existing, conviction that things had to change, but not necessarily through this anti-church and anti-religion and atheist position. This was very important, initially misunderstood, but over time it became part of the patrimony of the Catholic Church, this notion of the option for the poor, the commitment to social justice from the perspective of the gospel and not just from any political perspective. In my view, the most important contribution of Gutiérrez is the notion of one history, developed in his Theology of Liberation, but really the point that articulates his work over the years. The basic point here is that human history and sacred history are not sharply divided. It's not just about this world and the other world. It's not about earth and heaven. The point is that there is a strong connection, and this is not just an invention of progressive theology, but comes from this perspective of the Bible and the tradition of studying it. The point then is that without a sense of sharp separation between our human history and the world after this life, the notion of what happens when we think about Christ and salvation, the goal of, God for the whole creation, changes significantly. Because the idea is not simply that we are supposed to be here in this world, enduring the pains and sufferings that sometimes come with just living here, but actually there's something that can be done to avoid that suffering, to change the situations that produce it. Identifying precisely that poverty, injustice, and many forms of suffering are not something that God wants, are not a destiny for the poor, but something that can be changed, what Gutiérrez calls the identification of the causes of poverty, is an essential contribution to liberation, an essential contribution of Gutiérrez to think about Christian salvation. And this is the key, that salvation is not something just otherworldly, but salvation starts happening here, in this world, in the experience of many people who suffer and who want their suffering eradicated, who want their poverty eliminated. And this is again not just a political position, but something that Gutiérrez finds in his reading of the Bible and the Christian tradition. That God doesn't want for people just to embrace their suffering, embrace their poverty, but wants that we intervene in history to change the situation as an anticipation of that ultimate salvation that comes in heaven and after this life. This is something very important for Gutiérrez, and he does this examining, biblical revelation. He especially focuses in the example of Exodus and how, the liberation of the people of Israel from the oppression of Egypt was not just a moment of sacred divine intervention, but was also a very clear political event. They were liberated from political oppression, from slavery. And this is an example, among many others studied by Gutiérrez, of how sacred and profane history come together, how salvation is also a moment of political liberation, and gives Gutiérrez a cue to think about other forms in which this could happen. And since Christians read the Bible, not just as a document of archaeology, but something that speaks to them in this moment, in the very present. The task and the innovation of liberation theology consisted in seeing what kind of analogous situations can we find that make us think about ways in which Christians and God can intervene in history, both as a manifestation of God's love, but also as a way to liberate people from forms of political oppression and social injustice. So I thought a good way to focus on some of the key themes of liberation theology is to get a passage from the book and pay attention to it. This is from the concluding section, the concluding first part of the book. This is where Gustavo Gutiérrez distinguishes the three levels of liberation. Okay, so I'm going to just read briefly and comment on it. Liberation expresses, in the first place, the aspirations of social classes and oppressed peoples, and underscores the conflictual process of economic, social, and political changes, and how these affects especially the poor. In a second level, Gutiérrez notes, this is also about getting awareness in the world of the poor that they can be the owners of their own destiny. But lastly, and very importantly, none of these parts, the eradication of oppression or the gaining awareness of being the people who run our own destiny, is sufficient from a theological perspective if we do not think about the third element, which is liberation in Jesus Christ. For the Christian believer, the process of liberation is only completed through faith and through the works of Jesus in our lives. But, and this is very important, these three parts go together. The idea is not that we just wait for salvation and for liberation at the end of our lives, but that we work every day to eradicate the conditions of oppression and to gain more awareness, the fact that things can change and also can change us. One of the key themes of liberation theology is the notion of the preferential option for the poor. This is a theme that requires some attention because it's often misunderstood. Some people think that when we talk about preference, we talk about exclusive preference, as if, in this notion of the preferential option for the poor, God only loves the poor, and this undermines any sense of universal love for those who are not poor or do not experience marginalization. This has never been the position of liberation theologians like Gutiérrez, and it's also probably not the position if we think about God or Revelation. The idea here is that people who experience suffering and oppression, who are the victims of systems, that create inequality, experience the world in a different way than people who do not, experience poverty, marginalization. And this, in the Bible, very clearly in many ways, we have the attention of God, of Jesus in the New Testament, for those who are in the margins of society. This is where the notion of preferential option comes from. The idea that when we see injustice, when we see oppression, right, God also sees it. And God wants us, to be close to those who experience these forms of oppression. That by no means means that we're supposed to forget our duties of love and solidarity with all creation, by the way, not only human beings, but that we always keep an eye and keep our heart close to those who suffer the most. That is the idea. It's an idea that is included in the notion of universal love, but pays special attention to those who suffer the most. And one more thing is important to add here, that this is not because the poor merit this love in any special moral way. It's not because being poor means that one is better or, have greater moral standing than other people. This is never the issue. The issue is always that poverty itself is so destructive that it has to be eradicated, and we have to do something about it so people do not experience oppression and poverty. The question about what kind of people are the poor is a different question. But the theological move here is to think about solidarity with those who suffer the most, regardless of their merit. One of the main reasons to turn to liberation theology today, other than just witnessing the historical influence and trying to see how some works were influenced by Gutiérrez, is because some of the answers that Gutiérrez provided in the 70s, some of the work he did in terms of the balance between faith and politics may prove better than some current answers to questions of social justice. To give you one example, I think that the focus of Gutiérrez on marginalization and social injustice as an encompassing perspective may have better answers to questions of social justice than those that focus on ethnic identity. And just to see if this is the case and to compare some of these positions might be a good way to return to Gutiérrez and think about what he can say to us today in comparison to other answers to questions of social injustice in the 21st century. So some critics have argued that liberation theology is simply Marxism and communism with some religious, coloring and religious, language. But this is a misunderstanding. Many scholars of Marxism actually have identified that liberation theology was never really that Marxist. And they see this as a problem. But from the perspective of Christian theology, it's actually one of the great accomplishments of liberation theology. That these guys were never really, committed to the project of Orthodox Marxism, but they were trying to do something very different. They were committed to something way more basic, which is the identification of inequality and injustice in our societies, and asking the question for Christian religious believers, is this okay? Is this tolerable? Can we really tolerate this and claim for ourselves the name of Christians when we know from the Bible, we know from the tradition that God is committed to creation, and especially for those most vulnerable in creation? What liberation theology does, and is one of the genius moves of liberation theology, is takes Marxism as a serious conversation partner and takes some of the elements of Marxism as relevant for the production of a new theology. Which elements? The critique of religion, which liberation theology performs internally in the Catholic Church. They were very aware, Gutiérrez was very aware, of the problems and the long alliances of the state and church that often favor the state and favor certain people in the church, but not the poor and the marginalized. Gutiérrez takes this critique of Marxism seriously, and the critique of the existence of social structures that perpetuate injustice, takes these ideas, but also takes, revelation, the Christian tradition, and produces something new that responds to these questions of injustice from a perspective that is distinguishably Christian. On a more personal note, this text truly changed my life. I read Gutiérrez when I was in college, and it definitely changed everything for me. I truly thought when I was 18, 20, that the only way to be Christian, the only way to be Catholic was to be conservative and to be against, social developments and progressive ideas. I was completely unaware there was a whole tradition of theologians from my country, Peru, that were working on a different answer to the questions of injustice and progressive developments in our country. The idea that this could be done from the perspective of faith was completely novel to me and changed everything. I just couldn't imagine that. And then what also changed things for me was that I was able to meet Gutiérrez personally, and we became friends over the years, and the influence of this man was decisive. Not only as an intellectual, the most important thing was truly to see that all the ideas and the commitments present in these books and in these texts were really embodied in the life of a man who was really generous, committed to an intellectual task, and committed to solidarity with many who suffer. For further reading, I can think about three pieces that chronologically are very important to understand liberation theology. The first one is Alfred Henley's documentary History of Liberation Theology, published in 1990 by Orbis Books. This book, as you can imagine, is a collection of documents that were part of the history of the formation of liberation theology, and also documents that were issued as response, critiques over the years. The book covers documents until the 90s, but really gives any person who was to learn something about liberation theology a sense of the trajectory, the challenges, and the possibilities for the future. A second book worth recommending is Christian Smith's The Emergence of Liberation Theology, published in 1993. This is the best and most complete sociological account of the emergence of liberation theology. Smith is very good at parsing the history, some of the theological developments, and very specific things happening in between some of the important meetings of bishops and theologians up to the early 90s. The most important book covering that portion of the history of liberation theology in an argument articulating data from sociology, history, and many other disciplines. And the third book I think is very important for the understanding of liberation theology, especially in the decades that follow the 90s, is Daniel Grudy's The Option for the Poor in Christian Theology, which is a collection of essays by the most important liberation theologians, published, I believe, in 2001, that really has some of the most important makers of this theology thinking about the project 20, 25 years after, including now, the voices of many women who did feminist theology, eco-theology, migration theology, biblical scholarship influenced by liberation theology. It's a fantastic book to see the influence of liberation theology beyond its initial inception, and seeing how many scholars, not from Latin America necessarily, many from Europe, from the US, were influenced by this theology and really shaped their own disciplines through the work of Gustavo Gutiérrez's liberation theology. I hope I was able to persuade you of how important and revolutionary this book was, and I hope you can return to it to see, firsthand all the changes, all the moves, all the things that happen in this book that changed the history of theology in the 21st century.